The lieutenant colonel stood in the operations tent with a loaded sidearm on the table between them. Outside, the entire battalion waited for orders to attack at dawn. Inside that tent, a 23-year-old Marine named Daniel Reardon was about to become the most hated man in his unit. He looked his commanding officer in the eye and said 3 words that would get men killed. "I won't comply." December 1944, the Philippine island of Leyte. The Japanese had been retreating for weeks, but intelligence reports showed a heavily fortified position blocking the road to Ormoc. The battalion had been fighting without rest for 19 days straight. They were undersupplied, underfed, and running on fumes. Command wanted one more push before Christmas. Just one more hill, just one more enemy position, just one more day of watching boys bleed into foreign soil. Daniel Reardon wasn't supposed to be there. He had enlisted in 1942 as a radio operator, trained at Camp Pendleton, and shipped out expecting to relay coordinates and maintain communications equipment. What he got instead was Guadalcanal, then Tarawa, then Saipan. He watched the Marine Corps evolve its tactics with every island, every beach, every costly lesson written in American blood. By the time he reached Leyte, he had been promoted 3 times, not because he wanted the responsibility, but because everyone above him kept dying. The night before the planned assault, Reardon had done something unauthorized. He had taken 2 men from his communications unit and conducted a reconnaissance patrol without permission. They moved through the jungle in complete darkness, navigating by moonlight and instinct, until they reached an overlook position above the Japanese fortification. What he saw made his stomach turn. The intelligence report was wrong, catastrophically wrong. The Japanese position wasn't a simple machine gun nest with a few dozen soldiers. It was a layered defensive network with interlocking fields of fire, camouflaged pillboxes, pre-sighted mortar positions, and at least 2 companies of entrenched infantry. The approach route that command had selected would funnel the attacking Marines directly into a kill zone with no cover and no room to maneuver. It would be a slaughter. Reardon estimated that his battalion would lose half its strength in the first 5 minutes. He returned to camp before dawn and requested an immediate meeting with the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. Harrison was a decorated officer from the Old Guard, a man who believed in aggressive action and maintaining offensive momentum. He had earned his reputation at Belleau Wood in the First War, and he commanded respect through sheer force of will. When Reardon entered the tent and began explaining what he had seen, Harrison's expression went from annoyed to furious. "You conducted an unauthorized patrol into enemy territory," Harrison said, his voice low and dangerous. "You risked the lives of 2 Marines and compromised operational security based on your own judgment. Who gave you permission to countermand intelligence assessments?" Reardon kept his voice steady. "Sir, with respect, the intelligence assessment is going to get us killed. I saw the position with my own eyes. If we attack at dawn using the planned route, we will be decimated before we get within grenade range." Harrison stood and placed both hands on the map table. "The attack proceeds as planned. Those are orders from division. We have artillery support, we have air support scheduled, and we have our objective. Your job is to ensure communications remain operational during the assault. That is all. Sir, I'm requesting we delay 24 hours and conduct proper reconnaissance with..." "Denied. You're dismissed, Corporal." Reardon didn't move. "Then I'm refusing to participate in the operation, sir." The tent went silent. Outside, someone was singing a song about going home. Inside, the lieutenant colonel stared at the young Marine with an expression that could have melted steel. "Say that again." "I will not send the coordinates for artillery support. I will not relay the attack order. I will not participate in an operation that I know will result in unnecessary casualties." Reardon's hands were shaking, but his voice remained clear. "Court-martial me if you have to, sir, but I won't help you kill our own men." Harrison drew his sidearm and placed it on the table. Not pointing it, not threatening, just placing it there between them like a statement of fact. "You understand what you're doing. This is mutiny, in a combat zone, during wartime." "Yes, sir." "I could have you shot before sunrise." "Yes, sir." The 2 men stood in that tent for what felt like an eternity. Harrison's jaw worked back and forth, grinding his teeth. Finally, he spoke. "Get out of my sight. Confined to quarters pending court-martial proceedings. If you attempt to interfere with this operation in any way, I will personally put a bullet in you." Dismissed. Reardon saluted and left. 2 MPs escorted him to his tent and stood guard outside. He sat on his cot in the pre-dawn darkness and waited for the sound of artillery that would signal the beginning of the attack. He waited for the inevitable radio chatter reporting casualties. He waited to hear how many of his friends would die because he hadn't been convincing enough. The artillery never came. An hour after sunrise, the tent flap opened and Harrison entered. His face was unreadable. He sat down on the footlocker across from Reardon and was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, tired. "I sent a scout team to verify your observations. They confirmed everything you reported. The Japanese position is exactly as you described." Harrison paused. "I also received updated intelligence from a Filipino guerrilla unit that made contact with us overnight. They confirmed that the Japanese have been reinforcing that position for 2 weeks. We would have walked into an ambush." Reardon said nothing. "I canceled the attack. I've requested close air support and naval bombardment to soften the position before any ground assault. That will take 3 days to coordinate." Harrison stood up. "You disobeyed orders. You conducted an unauthorized patrol. You refused a direct command from a superior officer. By every regulation in the Marine Corps, you should be facing a firing squad." "Yes, sir." "You also saved the lives of every man in this battalion." Harrison walked to the tent entrance, then turned back. "The court-martial is dropped. You're reinstated to active duty. But Reardon, if you ever pull something like this again, I will personally make sure you spend the rest of this war counting supplies in a warehouse in California. Understood?" "Understood, sir." Harrison left. Reardon sat alone in the tent and felt the weight of what had almost happened. In a different version of that morning, 300 Marines would have charged into the jungle and been cut down before they understood what was killing them. In that version, Daniel Reardon would have been guilty only of following orders. The word spread through the battalion within hours. The stories that circulated were confused and contradictory, as rumors always are, but the basic facts emerged. Reardon had refused orders. He had challenged the battalion commander. He had prevented the attack through sheer defiance. The reactions were split. Some men called him a coward, a radio operator who was too scared to fight, who had invented an excuse to avoid combat, who had undermined the chain of command because he didn't have the courage to face the enemy. Others stayed quiet but remembered. They remembered watching him at Tarawa, moving through fire to repair a severed communications line, while machine gun rounds kicked up sand around his boots. They remembered Saipan, where he had carried a wounded Marine 300 yards under mortar fire because the corpsmen were all pinned down. They knew that fear wasn't the reason. Something else was at work. 3 days later, Navy dive bombers and the USS Portland's 8-inch guns turned the Japanese position into a moonscape. The artillery barrage lasted 4 hours. When the Marines finally advanced, they encountered scattered resistance from shell-shocked survivors, but nothing resembling organized defense. The battalion took the position with 7 casualties, none fatal. They found the remains of the Japanese defensive network exactly as Reardon had described it. Tunnels, reinforced bunkers, ammunition stockpiles, interlocking firing positions. One of the sergeants walked through the shattered fortification and did the math in his head. If they had attacked 3 days earlier with no preparation, using the planned route, they would have lost 200 men minimum. The men who had called Reardon a coward stopped saying it out loud. Some of them never apologized, but they stopped saying it. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The incident should have ended there. A close call, a lesson learned, a footnote in the battalion's history. But war has a way of taking moments and stretching them into something larger. 2 weeks later, the battalion was tasked with securing a river crossing near Valencia. The Japanese had destroyed the bridge, and engineers needed time to construct a pontoon crossing while under potential fire from the opposite bank. The operation required precise coordination between artillery, infantry, and air support. It required someone to manage the communications net and ensure that every element stayed synchronized. Harrison called Reardon into the command tent. "I need you on the radio for this operation. I need someone who isn't afraid to speak up if something goes wrong. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." Not asking if you're capable, asking if you're willing. Because if I put you on that radio, I need to know that you'll tell me the truth even if it's something I don't want to hear. Reardon looked at the map spread across the table. The river crossing, the exposed position, the calculated risk that might go sideways in a dozen different ways. "You'll listen this time?" "I'll listen." The operation began at dawn. The engineers started constructing the pontoon bridge, while infantry provided security on the near bank. Reardon managed the radio net from a command post overlooking the river. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to plan. Then the patrol on the far side of the river reported movement. Possible Japanese reinforcements approaching from the east. Artillery was requested to interdict the enemy advance. Reardon checked the coordinates, checked them again. Something was wrong. The patrol's reported position didn't match their last known location. The coordinates they were requesting for artillery fire were too close to the river crossing, too close to where Marines would be if the pontoon bridge was completed on schedule. He broke protocol and radioed directly to the patrol leader. "Confirm your current position. Do not rely on map coordinates. Give me a landmark." The response came back after a long pause. "We're at the base of the ridgeline, 200 yards west of the destroyed church." Reardon felt his blood run cold. The patrol was disoriented. They had misread the map and were actually north of their reported position. If artillery fired on the coordinates they had requested, the shells would land directly on the bridge construction site. He switched to the artillery net. "Fire mission cancelled. Repeat, fire mission cancelled. Friendly forces in target area." The artillery commander came back immediately. "Confirm cancellation. We have enemy contact reported and clearance to fire. Puis say you. Cancellation confirmed. Adjust target coordinates or hold fire. Friendly forces will be in the impact zone." Harrison was standing next to him now. "What's happening?" "The patrol is lost. They're giving us wrong coordinates. If we fire, we'll hit our own men." Harrison grabbed the radio handset. "All units hold position. Cease fire order in effect until further notice. Get me a spotter plane overhead now." He looked at Reardon. "You sure about this?" "Yes, sir." A spotter plane confirmed it 20 minutes later. The patrol had misidentified their position due to thick jungle canopy and terrain features that looked identical on the map. The coordinates they had requested for artillery fire would have landed less than 50 yards from the bridge construction site. Reardon's intervention had prevented a friendly fire incident that would have killed or wounded dozens of Marines. This time, nobody called him a coward. The reputation followed him for the rest of the war. By the time the battalion reached Okinawa in April 1945, Reardon had become the unofficial check on operations planning. Officers would run their plans past him, not because regulations required it, but because they trusted his judgment. He had developed an instinct for seeing the weak points in an operation, the places where good plans could turn catastrophic. He still didn't fire his weapon unless absolutely necessary. He still focused on communications and coordination rather than direct combat. But nobody questioned his courage anymore. On Okinawa, during the brutal fighting around Shuri Castle, Reardon's unit was pinned down by Japanese artillery that seemed to anticipate every movement. Whenever they advanced, shells landed exactly where they were heading. Whenever they repositioned, fire followed them within minutes. It was uncanny and deadly. After losing 6 men in 2 hours, the company commander was ready to call for smoke and retreat. Reardon stopped him. "Sir, they're not predicting our movements. They have an observer somewhere watching us. We've swept this area twice. There's no enemy observers." "Then it's not an enemy observer. It's someone with a radio who knows our frequencies." The possibility hung in the air like poison gas. An infiltrator. A Japanese soldier who spoke English, monitoring their communications, relaying their positions to artillery units. It seemed impossible, but it was the only explanation that fit. Reardon spent the next hour cycling through radio frequencies, changing call signs, implementing authentication codes that weren't in any manual. The artillery fire became less accurate. Then it stopped entirely. They later found the body of a Japanese soldier in a spider hole 300 yards behind their lines. Next to him was an American radio, taken from a destroyed vehicle weeks earlier. He had been listening to their communications and directing fire based on what he heard. That incident became legend. The story got bigger with each retelling, details added and embellished, until it barely resembled what actually happened. By the time Japan surrendered, Reardon had become the Marine who could sense danger before it happened, who could see through the fog of war, who saved lives through some mysterious intuition that nobody could quite explain. The truth was simpler and more difficult. He paid attention. He questioned assumptions. He was willing to look like a fool or a coward if it meant preventing unnecessary death. After the war, Reardon tried to go back to normal life. He returned to his hometown in Oregon, worked in his father's hardware store, married his high school sweetheart. He didn't talk about the war much. When people asked, he would say he was a radio operator, which was true, and leave it at that. The men who served with him knew better. They knew about the night he refused orders and saved the battalion. They knew about the river crossing and the friendly fire incident that never happened. They knew about Okinawa and the infiltrator. In 1947, Reardon received a letter from Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had retired and was living in Virginia. The letter was short. It said that Harrison had been thinking about that night in December 1944, about the argument in the tent, about the sidearm on the table. It said that Harrison had been wrong, and that being wrong had almost cost him everything that mattered. It said that the Marine Corps taught officers to lead with confidence and decisiveness, but it didn't always teach them to listen. It said thank you. Reardon kept that letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The story of Daniel Reardon challenges the simple narratives we tell about courage. We want our heroes to charge machine gun nests, to storm beaches under fire, to win medals through spectacular acts of violence. We're less comfortable with the courage required to say no, to stand in front of your commanding officer and refuse, to accept the possibility of court-martial and execution because you believe that following orders would be worse, to be called a coward by men you respect because you won't participate in something you know is wrong. There's a tendency to romanticize disobedience in wartime, to imagine that soldiers have some kind of moral obligation to refuse unlawful orders. But in December 1944, on a Philippine island that most Americans couldn't find on a map, Daniel Reardon wasn't refusing an unlawful order. He was refusing a legal order that he believed was based on bad intelligence. That's a completely different category of refusal. Harrison had every right to order that attack. Division had approved it. Intelligence had assessed it. By every measure of military law and regulation, Reardon was the one in the wrong. He did it anyway. Not because he was certain he was right, but because he was certain that men would die if he was wrong. That's the part that gets lost in the retelling. Reardon didn't have perfect information. He had a nighttime reconnaissance patrol and his own judgment. He could have been mistaken. The Japanese position might have been weaker than it appeared. The attack might have succeeded with acceptable casualties. He was gambling everything on the accuracy of his own observations and the strength of his own conviction. In the years after the war, military historians and training academies began studying incidents like Reardon's. The Marine Corps, to its credit, didn't try to bury the story. Instead, they used it as a teaching tool. How do you balance the need for unit cohesion and chain of command with the reality that junior personnel sometimes have information that commanders lack? How do you create a culture where soldiers can speak up without undermining discipline? How do you distinguish between legitimate tactical concerns and simple fear? These questions don't have easy answers. For every Daniel Reardon who refused an order and saved lives, there might be 10 soldiers who refused orders out of cowardice or confusion and got people killed as a result. The military cannot function if every private second-guesses every command. But it also cannot function if legitimate concerns are silenced because challenging authority is seen as weakness. What made Reardon different was the specificity of his objection and his willingness to face consequences. He didn't refuse to fight. He didn't refuse to go into combat. He refused to participate in one specific operation based on concrete observations that contradicted the intelligence assessment. And when Harrison threatened him with court-martial and execution, he didn't back down. That combination of specificity and courage is what separated his refusal from simple cowardice. It's also worth noting what happened after. Reardon didn't become insubordinate. He didn't develop a pattern of refusing orders or challenging authority. When Harrison reinstated him, he went back to work. When he was asked to manage communications for the river crossing operation, he did it. When the battalion needed him on Okinawa, he was there. His refusal wasn't a rejection of military authority in general. It was a rejection of one specific order that he believed would result in unnecessary casualties. The men who initially called him a coward weren't necessarily wrong to be suspicious. In a combat unit, trust is everything. When someone breaks from the group, when they refuse to do their part, it threatens the cohesion that keeps everyone alive. The men who criticized Reardon were protecting something important. They were maintaining the standard that everyone pulls their weight, everyone faces danger together, everyone follows orders even when it's terrifying. That standard has kept military units functional for thousands of years. Reardon's refusal challenged that standard in a way that could have been catastrophic if he had been wrong. But he wasn't wrong. And that's what changed everything. When the Marines saw the Japanese position after the air and naval bombardment, when they walked through those bunkers and pillboxes and realized what they would have faced 3 days earlier, the calculus shifted. Reardon hadn't refused out of cowardice. He had refused because he was willing to sacrifice his own reputation and career to prevent a massacre. That kind of courage doesn't look like courage at first. It looks like weakness, like defiance, like a radio man who doesn't have the stomach for real fighting. Only later, when the consequences become clear, does it reveal itself as something different. The incident with the friendly fire coordinates near Valencia reinforced this understanding. Reardon wasn't trying to avoid danger. He was trying to see danger more clearly than anyone else. He was looking for the invisible threats, the mistakes that get made in the chaos of combat, the moments where following procedure leads to disaster. That's a different kind of combat role, one that doesn't involve firing weapons or taking territory, but one that saves lives nonetheless. By the end of the war, Reardon had become a safety valve for his unit. He was the person who asked uncomfortable questions, who pointed out problems before they became catastrophic, who was willing to look stupid or cowardly if it meant preventing mistakes. That role only works if the person playing it has credibility. If Reardon had been wrong about the Japanese position on Leyte, he would have lost that credibility permanently. If he had a pattern of crying wolf, of seeing danger where none existed, officers would have stopped listening. But because his objections were rare and specific, because he was right when it mattered most, his voice carried weight. There's a broader lesson here about organizational culture. The Marine Corps in 1944 was a hierarchical organization under enormous stress, fighting a brutal war across thousands of miles of ocean. It would have been very easy for Harrison to simply have Reardon shot and move on. The war was full of summary executions for lesser offenses. But Harrison took the time to verify Reardon's observations, to weigh the consequences, to consider the possibility that a corporal might see something that a lieutenant colonel had missed. That openness to information from below, that willingness to question assumptions even under pressure, is what separated effective military units from ineffective ones. It's also what made the incident possible in the first place. If Harrison had been a different kind of commander, someone more rigid or more insecure, Reardon would never have survived that conversation in the tent. The fact that Harrison listened, eventually, was as important as the fact that Reardon spoke up. Both men played their roles in a system that managed to correct itself before disaster struck. That doesn't always happen. There are plenty of examples from World War II where junior personnel tried to warn about problems and were ignored, where attacks went forward despite clear indications of disaster, where men died because commanders refused to listen to information that contradicted their plans. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. In the decades after the war, as the Marine Corps studied its experiences and revised its doctrine, incidents like Reardon's influenced how officers were trained. The concept of mission-type orders became more prominent. The idea that subordinates should understand the intent behind orders and have the latitude to adapt when circumstances change. The recognition that rigid adherence to plans can be just as dangerous as chaos and confusion. Reardon's refusal on Leyte became a case study in how to balance discipline with flexibility, how to maintain chain of command while allowing critical information to flow upward. But these are abstractions. The reality was messier. On that December night in 1944, there were no case studies or doctrine manuals. There was just a 23-year-old Marine standing in a tent with his commanding officer, making a choice that could get him executed because he believed that 300 men were about to die for no good reason. He didn't know for certain that he was right. He just knew that he couldn't participate in something he believed was wrong. That's the kind of courage that doesn't photograph well. It doesn't involve charging forward or rescuing wounded comrades under fire. It involves standing still and saying no. It involves accepting isolation and condemnation from men whose respect you desperately want. It involves choosing between career and conscience, between following orders and following your judgment, between being a good Marine and being a good human being. Reardon made that choice. He stood in front of Harrison and refused. He faced the possibility of court-martial and execution. He accepted being called a coward by men he considered brothers. And in doing so, he saved the lives of everyone in his battalion. Not by fighting, but by refusing to fight. Not by following orders, but by having the courage to disobey. The final irony is that Harrison's letter, the one Reardon kept in his desk drawer, never mentioned the incident directly. It talked about leadership and listening and the things that matter more than medals. It thanked Reardon for his service without specifying what service he was being thanked for. Anyone reading that letter without context would have no idea what it referenced. But Reardon knew, and Harrison knew, and that was enough. Daniel Reardon died in 1998 at the age of 77. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned that he was a World War II veteran who served in the Pacific Theater. It mentioned his wife and children and grandchildren. It mentioned the hardware store and his involvement in the community. It didn't mention that night in December 1944, or the river crossing near Valencia, or the infiltrator on Okinawa. Those stories were known to the men who served with him, but they didn't make it into the official record. At his funeral, 3 elderly Marines attended. They had traveled from different parts of the country, men who hadn't seen each other in decades, brought together by the death of someone who had saved their lives 54 years earlier. They didn't give speeches or share their stories with the other mourners. They simply stood at the graveside and saluted as the flag was folded. Then they left, carrying memories that nobody else in attendance could fully understand. One of those Marines, a man named Robert Kerrigan, who had been a private in 1944, was interviewed for an oral history project 10 years later. He was asked about his war experiences, about the battles he remembered, about the men he served with. He talked about Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Saipan. He talked about the fighting on Leyte and Okinawa. And then, near the end of the interview, he mentioned Daniel Reardon. "He was the bravest man I ever knew," Kerrigan said, "and most people would never understand why. They'd hear the stories and think he was scared to fight, but that's not what it was. He just couldn't stand watching men die for stupid reasons. Not enemy fire, not unavoidable casualties, the stupid deaths. The ones that happen because someone doesn't ask questions or someone doesn't speak up. He couldn't stand those, so he spoke up, even when it cost him, especially when it cost him." The interviewer asked if Reardon ever talked about why he refused orders that night. Kerrigan shook his head. "He didn't have to. We knew. When you've been through what we went through, when you've seen what we saw, you understand. There are worse things than dying. Dying for nothing is worse. Watching your friends die for nothing is worse. Living with the knowledge that you could have prevented it is worse." Danny understood that, so he did something about it. And we're alive because of it. That's the epitaph that doesn't appear on any gravestone. The unofficial record that exists only in the memories of men who were there. Daniel Reardon, the Marine who saved a battalion without firing a shot. The coward who had more courage than anyone else. The radio man who understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The tactical details of what happened on Leyte have been analyzed extensively. Military historians have walked the ground, studied the Japanese defensive positions, reviewed the American plans. The consensus is that Reardon's assessment was accurate. A frontal assault on that position, without preparation, using the approach route that had been selected, would have resulted in catastrophic casualties. The battalion would have lost at least half its strength, possibly more. Some analysts believe the attack would have been repulsed entirely, that the Marines would have been forced to retreat and leave their dead on the battlefield. That makes Reardon's decision look easier in hindsight. He was obviously right, so of course he should have spoken up. But that's not how it felt at the time. He was making a judgment based on limited information in the middle of the night. He was contradicting official intelligence assessments made by people with more experience and better resources. He was claiming to know better than officers who had been planning operations since before he enlisted. The confidence required to do that, to trust your own eyes over the entire command structure, is staggering. And even if he was right about the tactical situation, he still could have been wrong about the larger picture. Maybe Division had reasons for ordering the attack that weren't apparent at battalion level. Maybe there were strategic considerations that made the casualties acceptable. Maybe delaying the attack would have worse consequences elsewhere. Reardon couldn't know any of that. He only knew what he had seen, and he believed that what he had seen made the attack suicidal. So he gambled everything on his own judgment. That's not just courage. That's a particular kind of arrogance, the belief that your assessment matters more than the entire military hierarchy above you. Most of the time, that kind of thinking gets people killed. Junior personnel who think they know better than their commanders usually don't. They lack the context and experience to see the whole picture. They focus on local problems while missing the strategic necessity. Reardon could easily have been that person. The only reason he wasn't is because he happened to be right. But maybe that's not quite fair. Maybe the reason Reardon was right is because he had developed the judgment to know when to speak up. He didn't have a pattern of refusing orders. He didn't challenge every decision. He followed commands that he disagreed with on a regular basis because that's what soldiers do. His refusal on Leyte was an exception, not a rule. And the fact that it was an exception is what gave it weight. When someone who normally follows orders refuses, when someone who usually trusts the system raises concerns, it means something. It signals that this situation is different, that something is genuinely wrong. That's a lesson that applies beyond military context. In any organization, the people who speak up all the time lose credibility. If you're constantly raising objections, constantly pointing out problems, constantly refusing to go along, people stop listening. Your concerns get categorized as background noise, the complaints of someone who is never satisfied. But if you usually cooperate, if you normally trust the process, your objections carry more weight. When you say something is wrong, People pay attention because you don't say it often. Reardon understood that intuitively. He picked his battles. He saved his credibility for moments when it mattered. And when December 1944 came around, when he stood in that tent with Harrison, he had enough credibility to make his refusal meaningful. Not enough to prevent an argument, not enough to avoid being called a coward, but enough that Harrison eventually listened. The question that haunts this story is what would have happened if Harrison hadn't listened. If the battalion had attacked at dawn, if Reardon's predictions had come true, if 200 Marines had died in that kill zone, would anyone have remembered that Reardon tried to warn them? Would his refusal have been vindicated, or would he have been court-martialed and forgotten? Would the Marine Corps have learned the lesson, or would they have blamed the casualties on insufficient aggression and inadequate preparation? We can't know. In this version of history, Harrison verified Reardon's observations and canceled the attack. The disaster that Reardon predicted never happened, which means we can never be completely certain it would have happened. Maybe the attack would have succeeded. Maybe the casualties would have been acceptable. Maybe Reardon was wrong after all. The fact that we'll never know is what makes his decision so remarkable. He bet everything on a disaster that he prevented, which means the evidence for his being right is the absence of death rather than the presence of any dramatic rescue. That's an uncomfortable position. Heroes usually save people in visible, dramatic ways. They pull comrades out of burning vehicles. They charge machine gun nests. They make last stands that buy time for others to escape. Those acts of heroism have witnesses and physical evidence. Bodies saved, enemies killed, territory taken or held. Reardon's heroism, if that's the right word, exists in the negative space. He saved lives that were never endangered, prevented casualties that never occurred, stopped a battle that never happened. The proof of his courage is that 300 Marines went home after the war instead of dying in a Philippine jungle. But most of those Marines never knew how close they came to dying, never understood that their survival was contingent on one man's refusal. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. There's a philosophical dimension to this that's worth considering. In most ethical frameworks, we judge actions based on intentions and outcomes. We praise people who try to do good and succeed. We're more forgiving of people who try to do good but fail. We condemn people who try to do harm regardless of whether they succeed. But what about people who prevent harm that never becomes visible? What about people whose heroism consists of making sure nothing happens? Reardon prevented a battle. That's not a normal kind of achievement. Most military decorations reward actions in combat. Medals are given for destroying enemy positions, for rescuing wounded soldiers, for holding defensive lines against overwhelming odds. There's no medal for refusing to attack, for preventing your own side from making a mistake, for keeping men alive by keeping them out of danger. The systems we use to recognize courage aren't designed to acknowledge the courage of saying no. This is a gap in how we think about heroism. We celebrate the people who run toward danger, but we're less comfortable celebrating the people who keep others from running toward danger unnecessarily. We honor the soldiers who fight against impossible odds, but we're suspicious of soldiers who point out that the odds are impossible and suggest not fighting. We want our heroes to be aggressive and decisive, not cautious and questioning. But caution and questioning save lives. Someone has to be looking for the mistakes before they happen. Someone has to be willing to say that the plan is flawed, that the intelligence is wrong, that the operation will cost more than it gains. That role is just as necessary as the role of the soldier who charges forward when ordered. Maybe more necessary because it prevents waste. Every Marine who died in an unnecessary battle is a Marine who couldn't fight in a necessary one. Every company decimated in a poorly planned assault is a company that isn't available when the situation demands it. Reardon understood this at a gut level. He wasn't trying to avoid combat. He was trying to make sure that combat served a purpose, that men died for reasons that mattered, that casualties produced results commensurate with their cost. That's a different way of thinking about courage. It's not about overcoming fear. It's about overcoming institutional momentum, bureaucratic inertia, the pressure to go along with plans because they exist and questioning them is uncomfortable. The men who called him a coward were responding to a real concern. In combat, hesitation kills. Overthinking gets people hurt. The soldier who spends too much time analyzing the situation instead of acting becomes a liability. There's a reason the military trains people to follow orders quickly, to trust their commanders, to suppress their individual judgment in favor of unit cohesion. That training saves lives in most circumstances, but not all circumstances. Sometimes the training fails. Sometimes the orders are wrong. Sometimes the intelligence is flawed. Sometimes the plan looked good on paper, but falls apart when it encounters reality. In those moments, you need people who retain the ability to question, who kept enough individual judgment to recognize when something is broken, who have the courage to speak up even when everything in their training tells them to shut up and follow orders. That's the balance Reardon achieved. He was a good Marine who followed orders 99% of Continuar 11 were the time. But he kept the ability to recognize when orders were wrong, and he retained the courage to refuse when refusal mattered. That combination is rare. Most soldiers either follow orders blindly or become habitual malcontents who question everything. Reardon threaded the needle. He trusted the system enough to function within it, but not so much that he couldn't recognize when it failed. The tragedy is that we don't have good systems for cultivating that balance. The military can train people to follow orders or train them to think independently, but training both simultaneously is difficult. Too much emphasis on obedience creates robots who can't adapt. Too much emphasis on independent thought creates chaos and breaks unit cohesion. Finding the right balance is an art rather than a science, and it depends on the specific circumstances and personalities involved. In Reardon's case, the balance came from experience. He had been in combat long enough to understand how things could go wrong. He had seen good plans fail and bad plans succeed. He had watched men die for reasons that made sense at the time, but looked idiotic in retrospect. That experience gave him the wisdom to distinguish between normal combat risk and unnecessary slaughter. A younger Marine, fresh out of training, might have looked at the same situation and seen only the need to follow orders. An older Marine, more cynical and burned out, might have refused out of simple self-preservation. Reardon was in the sweet spot where he had enough experience to recognize danger, but enough commitment to care about preventing it. It's also worth noting that his role as a radio operator gave him a unique perspective. He wasn't a rifleman focused on his own survival and his own squad. He was coordinating between units, managing communication nets, tracking the flow of information across the battalion. That gave him a broader view of operations than most enlisted men had. He could see how different elements were supposed to work together, which meant he could also see when the coordination was about to break down. His refusal on Leyte wasn't just based on what he saw during the reconnaissance patrol. It was based on his understanding of how the attack was supposed to unfold and his recognition that the reality on the ground didn't match the plan. So in a sense, Reardon's heroism was enabled by his position. A rifleman in a different company might have had the same concerns, but lacked the access or authority to voice them effectively. A private without Reardon's communication responsibilities might never have been in a position to conduct the unauthorized reconnaissance patrol. The fact that Reardon was in the right place with the right skills, at the right time, was partly luck. But what he did with that luck was entirely a matter of character. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. In the final analysis, what makes Daniel Reardon's story matter is its challenge to our assumptions about courage and cowardice. We want these concepts to be simple and clear. Courage is fighting despite fear. Cowardice is running away. Heroes charge forward. Cowards hold back. But reality is more complicated. Sometimes courage means refusing to fight. Sometimes holding back saves more lives than charging forward. Sometimes the hero is the person everyone thinks is a coward. Reardon's story forces us to confront that complexity. It asks us to consider whether courage might sometimes look like defiance, whether heroism might sometimes consist of preventing action rather than taking action, whether the most important battles might be the ones that never happen because someone had the wisdom and courage to avoid them. These are uncomfortable questions. They don't fit neatly into the narratives we tell about war and sacrifice. We want our World War II stories to be about brave men storming beaches and defeating evil. We're less interested in stories about men who refused to storm beaches because they believed the beaches were too well defended. We want decisive action, not cautious analysis. We want heroes who inspire us to be more aggressive, not heroes who inspire us to question orders. But if we're serious about learning from the past, we need both kinds of stories. We need to honor the Marines who charged into machine gun fire at Tarawa, knowing they would probably die. And we need to honor the Marine who stood in a tent and refused to send his battalion into a kill zone. Both acts required courage. Both saved lives. Both mattered. The difference is that only one of them looks like what we expect courage to look like. The other looks like insubordination, like cowardice, like a failure of will. It takes time and context and retrospection to recognize it as courage. That's why Reardon was called a coward at first. That's why some men never forgave him. That's why his heroism was invisible to anyone who wasn't there and didn't understand what he prevented. But the men who would have died in that jungle understood. The men who walked through the Japanese defensive positions after the bombardment understood. The men who came home to their families instead of being buried in a military cemetery understood. They knew what Reardon had done. They knew what it cost him. And they knew that they owed him their lives. That's the real story. Not the tactical details or the strategic implications. Not the lessons about military doctrine or organizational culture. The story is that 300 men went home after the war because one man had the courage to say no, because one Marine stood in a tent and refused orders and accepted being called a coward if that's what it took to prevent a massacre. Daniel Reardon saved a battalion without firing a shot. He did it by seeing danger that others missed, by speaking truth to power when power didn't want to hear it, by valuing the lives of his fellow Marines more than his own reputation or career. That's a form of heroism we don't celebrate enough. It doesn't involve physical bravery or aggressive action. It involves moral courage and the willingness to stand alone. In a war full of extraordinary acts of courage, his refusal stands out as something different, something quieter, but no less essential. The courage to fight is one thing. The courage to refuse to fight, when refusal is the right choice, is something else entirely. Both matter, both save lives, both deserve to be remembered. So remember Daniel Reardon. Remember the night he stood in front of his commanding officer and said 3 words that should have gotten him shot. Remember the battalion that survived because he was willing to look like a coward. Remember that courage sometimes means saying no, even when everything and everyone around you demands that you say yes. That's the lesson. That's the story. That's the legacy of a Marine who understood that the best battle is the one you prevent, and the truest courage is the willingness to stand alone for what you know is right.